Hello, everyone, and welcome to Milton Keynes Lit Fest and to the first event in our 2025 online programme. January is becoming Urbanism and Built Environment Month for us. Last year, we welcomed Owen Hatherley and John Grindrod in conversation about new towns around the world, their similarities and differences, their aspirations and trajectories. You can still watch a replay on YouTube if you would like to. We'll post a link in the chat shortly. As befits a literary festival from what is arguably the UK's most famous new town, and now, of course, a city, and a place whose buildings frequently evoke comment and opinion, we're returning to our architectural theme this evening. We're delighted to welcome back John Grindrod, who many of you will know as a social historian of modern places. His books include Concretopia, Outskirts, and Icon. John has given talks all over the UK and written for publications including The Guardian, Telegraph, and Big Issue. You can hear his new podcast, Monstrosities Mon Amour, on his Substack, Grindrodia. John will be in conversation tonight with Simon Phipps. A graduate in sculpture from the Royal College of Art, he's now an acclaimed photographer of post-war modernist architecture, art, and design. He's the author of a number of books, including Brutal London, Finding Brutalism, Concrete Poetry, Brutal North, Outer Brutal London, and the recently published Brutal Wales. I'm going to have a stab at Cymru Friotaliaeth. I'm probably hopelessly wrong. Finding Brutalism was a winner of the 2018 DAM Architectural Book Award and won a bronze medal at the German Photo Book Award 2018. Outer Brutal London was shortlisted for the Architecture Book of the Year Award 2023. At which point, let me hand over to Simon and John for tonight's visual tour of Britain's modern places. As a courtesy, please stay muted during their conversation. If you have questions for them, please post them in the chat window and we'll take as many of them as we can at the end of the event. We hope you enjoy the evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Milton Keynes Lit Fest, for having us. And where else can you enjoy a tour around brutalist Britain in your pajamas from your sofa than with Milton Keynes Literary Festival? So that's pretty exciting. Really lovely. So many of you have come along on a Wednesday evening, or any evening. It doesn't have to be Wednesday evening. And this is going to be a really, really smashing thing because we're getting to see loads of Simon's brilliant photos and go on a little tour around the country via his explorations and his records of them, which is going to be great. So hello, Simon.
Hello, John. Very nice to be here. And thanks for your very warm intro.
Well, this should be really fun because we've obviously collaborated on some stuff before, and we've spoken about your photography before. So it's going to be really lovely to be able to kind of explore that stuff in more depth, and also to kind of look at a few places that I know I don't know particularly well, and some places that are incredibly familiar. So it's going to be really, really nice to explore that. So shall we plunge straight in?
I think that would be best.
Yes, lovely. Just going to get the presentation going. Ta-da! There we are. Can you all see that? Excellent. I'm seeing thumbs up, which is hopefully a good sign. So here we are. We are starting, controversially for me, in as a denizen of Croydon, we're starting in Bromley, which is outrageous, obviously. We're starting at the Mall in Bromley, which is, for a lot of people, will be quite an unfamiliar brutalist bit of architecture. And yet there it is, right in the middle of suburban London.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me also, it was completely unfamiliar until I just stumbled across it. I was working on the book, Outer Brutal London, sort of concentrating on the outer London suburbs, and this was just a magnificent find for me. I was completely unaware of it. I came through from the front of this is the rear elevation, and the front actually faces onto the high street. So I came through a really rather drab and unassuming looking shopping centre. I was trying to find a bus stop actually to take me out of Bromley. But I came through to
Very
this
familiar, very familiar thought from me as well.
familiar experience, yeah. So yes, I came out onto this the street to the rear of it, and it just found this kind of phenomenal elevation. And I had no idea who the architect was or anything about it really. And it took a bit of research to track down the architect, and it kind of shouldn't have been a surprise really, because it was by the Owen Luder partnership. Owen Luder specialized in kind of commercial architecture with developers who they put together basically a car park, housing and shopping facilities all in one sort of mega block, and this really does that. So you can just see the block of flats peeking up above the car park decks, and
It's right slap bang in the middle of all of their kind of big classic bits of architecture as well, isn't it? It's just after the Tricorn and Trinity Square in Gateshead, and then the Catford Centre, which I guess is a much more familiar bit of Owen Luder shopping centre architecture in London. That comes slightly after, so it's right in the middle of much more well-known pieces, and it's extraordinary that this one has slightly eluded people.
It sort of seems just past people by, maybe because it's in Bromley, I don't know, but the it really is quite a remarkable piece, and it's pretty much it's fairly intact. I mean, it's had the usual coating of magnolia paint, which kind of ruins the concrete surfaces on brutalist architecture, but apart from that, it's pretty much as built, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas the shopping centre itself has been completely remodeled, hasn't it? Sort of inside. So that's
Yes, yeah,
slightly different. But this, as you said, the sort of rear elevation of it is pretty pristine.
it is. Yes, a little mega structure in Bromley, which should be visited by more people, I think, because it's rather magnificent.
Oh, I now want to do a book called A Little Mega Structure in Bromley, but there we are. And the second place that we're going to is much more familiar, although brilliantly, I think here what you've done is you've actually chosen quite unfamiliar elevation or an unfamiliar view of buildings that actually people might be a lot more familiar with in a different way. So these are from the University of East Anglia. This is the Library Building and Suffolk Terrace, both designed by Dennis Lasden and partners and built in the 1960s to the early 70s. As part of his sort of golden age, the Royal College of Physicians was just before this, and the National Theatre and the University of London were just after. So it's slap bang in the middle of his kind of golden phase that he had. And how do you find these sort of new angles on quite familiar landmarks and landscapes?
Well, I mean, obviously everyone's seen the ziggurat student accommodation and the teaching wall, and those are equally as fantastic as pieces of architecture. But the library always kind of gets a little bit overlooked, and I think it's because it was a later part of the campus, and as it says there, it was actually completed by Bernard Fielden, who was the university architect. He took over from Dennis Lasden. Lasden finished his work as much as he thought he could. I think he just, I don't know. I don't know the full story, but maybe he'd have reached an impasse on how much of the continued development of the student accommodation would be allowed to happen, because initially it was a much more ambitious plan for that, and I think they only built 2 blocks, one of which is Suffolk Terrace on the right hand side. The terraces themselves, you can see the stairway up there. It leads to a kind of elevated pedestrian walkway, which was a very 60s thing. I mean, it was all about removing the pedestrian from contact with motor vehicles. So a lot of the accommodation was entered from this top deck, and if you take the stairway up to the top there, that will lead you along an elevated walkway, which is at the top of the ziggurats. But the remarkable thing for me was the angle on the actual staircase. I mean, it becomes such an incredible sculptural form when you're getting close to it and actually look at the way all the forms interlock, and the way the shadow and light plays upon them. I mean, for me, that was just a perfect moment when that sun was hitting that at the right moments, creating a sort of photograph that's almost a sculpture, and that's what I quite like about all the stuff I've presented tonight. It's very much about the sculptural form, and and as much as the library there, I was working on a project which involved staying over, and it was great seeing the library at night. I'd never seen it before because it illuminated from the outside, from the inside. The whole of the structure is displayed, probably more coherently than you might even see it in the daylight. It really, really does sort of give you that kind of very strong impression of how that structure is actually constructed.
Yeah,
So yeah,
and also for kind of buildings that feel very, very solid, suddenly at night you've got this great big kind of like glowing thing that feels much more open and transparent, which is very interesting, isn't it, as well?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it just shows how much glazing there is in that building, which is quite often concealed by the structural concrete elements, which kind of can possibly overpower it in the daylight. But certainly at night, you can see it in full display there.
Yeah, absolutely. And now the next image, very different in terms of light and permeability, because we are looking at the abstract wall relief on Elmbank Gardens, part of the Charing Cross development in Glasgow, designed by Keith McCarter in 1972, who's a Scottish sculptor who was born in 1936, and he's still alive now, I believe. And from a Milton Keynes perspective, there is a link. Celestial, which was his work that was on the Southampton headquarters for the Ordnance Survey Building, is now stored in a field in Milton Keynes. So I'm suggesting that everybody that is from Milton Keynes as part of this event, we all go and hunt that down and give it a big hug.
Well, I can tell you where it is. It's at the Milton Keynes Discovery Centre.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Is stacked up in a pile. I mean, these are massive slabs of concrete. It was built in conjunction with the Richard Seaford partnership, who did all the development around the Charing Cross station. And above this, there's a large tower block, typical kind of Seaford tower block, but which I think is, I don't know, a Premier Inn or something now.
Yeah.
But below this, there's these walkways that pass the station, and these blocks are something. I wrote it down because I thought it was quite impressive. There's 19 of these slabs, and they're 130 centimeters wide. So you get the scale, the idea of the scale. And these sculptors like Keith McCarter were working a lot in conjunction with the redevelopment of city centres. Probably better known as William Mitchell, who did many of these kind of abstract friezes and sculptural walls and things. Some freestanding, some attached to buildings. But this one, I just loved the sweep of it and the rhythm of those forms that take you right through the sort of pilotis of the Seaford structure above, and then out into a kind of wider open area.
It's a lovely kind of like quite a kind of friendly sort of continuation along in an area that otherwise could feel kind of a bit barren, because it is these huge blocks. Which are, now you were sort of talking about the kind of sculptural elements of brutalism that were attracting you, but you started out as a sculptor, didn't you, before you were a photographer?
Yeah, that's what I did. That I was studied sculpture at the Royal College of Art, and I was very much still, even then, I was into the built environment. I should probably add that my parents were both architects for the Milton Keynes Development Corporation, amongst other companies that they worked for. My mother worked for John Bonington, who was the ex-partner of Basil Spence, and my father was a partner with YRM Architects, who did some stunning architecture around the country. And, you know, growing up, we would go to see architectural sites, probably quite reluctantly for me, but something obviously rubbed off because I was stunned. All my sculpture really was kind of about the built environment and architecture. And I began to take photographs as reference material for my sculptures. Just continued that because I enjoyed it. And yeah, it kind of built into its own photographic practice. So.
Incredible. And your work really, it does feel like it's sort of some way, even the photography feels like it's some way between photography and sculpture, in that they're all kind of exploring that idea, aren't they, of kind of the sculptural properties of the places that you are photographing.
That's, yeah, primarily that's what I'm always looking for. And sometimes it might be to the detriment of the architecture itself, or because I quite like, I like all, as well as showing the entirety of the building. I get particularly involved in looking at the spatial qualities and the vistas and the way that light and shadow work. And so in this particular photograph that we're looking at now, it's a kind of crop, but it gives an indication of what more there is. So I'm always looking to present things in a way that suggests that there's other ways of looking at this, but this is my particular take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now the next image, and we're off to Wales, the Bramble Building in Bangor, designed by the Percy Thomas Partnership and built in the very late 60s and early 70s. Now, this is very reminiscent of Boston City Hall by Cowman, McKinnell and Knowles, which was finished just before this one. And both buildings show a real kind of sense of kind of classical roots to the brutalist architecture, which is really interesting. They're sort of playing on a lot of kind of classical architecture tropes. Percy Thomas is one of those practices that worked, you know, across the 20th century. They were sort of ubiquitous in Wales. Did a lot of buildings that you know you will recognise, and you know we're still going right up to the millennium with the Millennium Centre in Cardiff, and embraced lots and lots of different styles. So very much not a practice you would necessarily associate with brutalism, are they? And yet, when you were travelling around Wales, you did find quite a lot of examples of their brutalist work.
I did. They seem to be ubiquitous in Wales, and a lot of their buildings are brutalist, I would say, particularly this one. I mean, this takes all those kind of brutalist sensibilities of it, express structure, materials as found. The below the second layer of the upper deck, all that infill at the back is red brick. So it's just a really quite classical facade, really. It looks the elevation is really with those pilotis. It's almost like a kind of Greek temple, but in concrete, which really appeals to me. And the way that and as you say, it's almost also relevant. It takes on that kind of inverted ziggurat structure that I think was going on a lot in the US in terms of that Boston town hall that you just mentioned, and a lot of university buildings. So they're obviously looking at ideas that are broader than possibly the townscape of Bangor. And it's a bit more of an internationalist approach to
I think that's fair to say.
the architecture, and it's actually quite it has a great heritage, that building. I was just reading about it, and it was named after Francis Bramble, and apparently he was responsible for huge scientific discoveries, including how immunity to disease is passed from mothers to children in embryo, which is quite massive, really.
Yeah.
And he insisted that this building should have a zoological museum inside. I didn't get as far as finding out why he thought that was appropriate, but there is a museum inside, which unfortunately was closed when I was there. I'd like to have seen it.
Wow. Yeah. No, I would say that building is probably unfamiliar to some people, but this one, not so much. The Barbican Centre, City of London, obviously designed by Chamberlain, Powell and Bon, built over a very long period of time. The whole Barbican estate, although the Barbican Centre, the art centre, was between 71 and 82. Now, there are some really, really interesting perspectives here. Again, you've sort of chosen not the obvious stuff to show. And I think one of the interesting things here is the amount of different materials you can see going on. I think quite often in people's minds, the Barbican is rough concrete. It's that bush hammered concrete. And yet here, we've got glass, we've got tiles, we've got the brick floor, we've got lots and lots of different stuff going on, which is really lovely. And I think there's a really varied landscape here and really varied materials. And your photography really seems to really enjoy this kind of mix of different stuff going on.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, originally, the Chamberlain, Powell and Bon had spec'd for white marble towers, mosaic everywhere, all sorts of fabulous finishes. That the City of London obviously thought, well, actually, we can't really afford that. Just do it in concrete and then bush hammer it just to make it, look a little bit more interesting. But you can see the effect that have even the white tiles, even the tiles have in contrast to the concrete, and it adds that extra kind of layer of interest to the compositions. And I particularly love that glass tower that sort of emerges between the two huge the blocks with the huge kind of expressed balconies that jut out. And it's a great place for finding all these different viewpoints. I mean, the angles you can find are it offers so much. It's endless in what you could spend just weeks at the Barbican discovering all this. And I just wanted to focus a bit more on the centre, because we're always looking at pictures of the sort of sawtooth towers and things. But I think the centre itself deserves a lot more notice than just the fact that I mean, obviously it's a world-renowned venue for theatre, for music and art, but the architecture itself is phenomenal, I think, and it's worth looking at again and again. And it's interesting, these the views I've taken. The one on the left-hand side, that was originally that was the original entrance to the Barbican Art Gallery, and the one on the far right is the gallery itself with it has those white tiled cubes are actually galleries that are pushed out in the interior of the building. When you go in and look, there's a row of smaller galleries on the upper level that extrude, and this is the outer extrusion of those. So again, it's that kind of example of brutalism and express structure. And then out past those cubes, there's an actual sculpture courtyard. Originally, it was meant to be a sculpture concourse. The centre picture is down at lake level, and that again originally was the entrance to the centre, the centre itself. And the whole idea was that the Barbican was meant to be plugged into this massive network of pedways, pedestrian walkways, which were going to be sort of cross the city. There's only very few of them left now, though most of them have been demolished, but because that idea went out of the window of this. I don't know. You maybe know more about this, John, than I do, but I don't know why it was deemed that the pedways were a ridiculous idea and they should be got rid of. But for a while, there was quite a big network of them, and they've gradually been dismantled over the years, which sometimes makes the Barbican level seem a bit strange, but it's not really that strange because they were always designed to be plugged into this network of walkways at different levels.
I think there was this kind of idealistic idea that everywhere would kind of move to this idea of being on a deck level because you'd have cars going underneath. But what happened with that kind of city walkway, the pedway, was that it encounters areas that actually are much older than that and don't really want to change. And I think that's partly what happens, is that it meets the real world outside of its own boundaries, and then at that point they kind of realize they can't continue it, and then it all slightly kind of freezes, and that's why it stops kind of growing. I think,
Yeah.
at that point, so you do reach these kind of odd barriers of that walkway.
Interestingly, though, they've kind of constructed a new part of
Yeah,
Pedway.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely, yeah, they replaced a bit, didn't they?
yeah, around the back of the Salters Hall.
Mm, yeah. I think that might have even been Make Architecture did that, although I may be wrong. But yeah, it's sort of an
Yeah.
unlikely company to do that as well. But we're going to move on to a building that maybe people know, less familiar with, the Medical Sciences Institute in Dundee. This was designed by Mackie, Ramsey and Taylor and built in 1970. Now, I think this building is really reminiscent of quite a lot of Scottish brutalism, which I think is very distinctive. This idea of kind of quite rough materials. You sort of see buildings of this ilk in Cumbernauld. It slightly reminds me of the St. Peter's Seminary in Cardross. And there is a kind of Le Corbusier sort of confidence to a lot of this Scottish brutalism that I think is amazing. The architects here were Aberdonian company, formed in 1960, and it was still going. But yeah, I think this is amazing because a lot of brutalist sort of fan groups sort of share images of Barbican all the time, and to a lot of kind of eye rolling of, oh, not the Barbican again. And then yeah, there were all these kind of incredible buildings around the country that maybe get less of a kind of showing. Are you going out of your way to kind of showcase some of these buildings? Because it does seem like you really kind of, I mean, this is not a particularly obscure one, but for some of the stuff that you have photographed, it's not necessarily the obvious building at all.
No, well, I'm actually working on a book about Scotland at the moment, so I thought this was opportune to throw into the mix.
Lovely.
But I just think it's such a phenomenal building and utterly unexpected. It's part of the University of Dundee, and it's a significant building. It's been towards the back of it. You can see where it's been extended. Um, but apparently, and I haven't been able to verify this, but those two upper stories themselves are an extension.
Yeah, I'd heard that as well, and you can sort of see how that could happen, but it sort of as a result, it sort of feels like the building is giving itself a hug.
Yes, it, it's yeah, and the that end solution of okay, we're going to overhang this, but we're going to have these two massive pilotis out of boardmark concrete, and it
Yeah,
looks great. So for me the surprise of finding these buildings. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in Scotland over the last couple of years, and just finding these. I didn't really know about this building before, and I mean, I do a lot of research on uh, Google Earth actually, and through various online archives and dictionaries and resources. But I had seen this online, you know, Google Street View, but nothing really prepares you for seeing the reality of it.
it's
And
immense, isn't it?
it's just great, and it's phenomenally huge and a proper piece of brutalist architecture. And there's a lot in Scotland.
Yeah,
There must have been it was a particularly rich time for architectural firms up there. I think there was a lot of talent, and I think there were lots of interesting ideas going on. And there was a lot of public commissions through housing, local government, and obviously university commissions were coming through. So yeah, there's a lot to discover up there, and hopefully it's all going to come out in my book later this year.
exciting, exciting. Somewhere else where there was a lot of kind of British architecture going on was throughout Yorkshire, and your book Brutal North kind of covers a lot of kind of this amazing kind of outpouring of brutalist architecture in northern England. This is High Point in Bradford, and it was designed by John Tempest from John Brunton and Partners, built in 1972. This was the former Yorkshire Building Society headquarters, and it's now an apartment block. And one of the things I love about it is it's covered in corduroy concrete, which are my favourite finishes for a brutalist building, which is sort of designed so that the rain channels down through the corduroy. And they also designed Kirkgate Market in a sort of quite a similar style. So, I mean, lots of the buildings that you photographed have undergone loads of change, but you seem more interested to show elements that are preserved sort of as they were sort of intended originally. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always like to go back in time and sort of photograph it as the building was finished, really, because a lot of the additions and the modifications and the the repurposing ends up in very, very unsympathetic and unattractive, to my mind, iterations of what was once a glorious building, probably ruined by putting some plastic cladding all over it or painting it magnolia paint. But this is the High Point as it was. I can't remember, 5 years ago or so, and it has actually been converted into flats now, and I think it reasonably successfully. They didn't mess around too much. John Tempest is actually an old pal of my dad, and they went to college in Leeds together, and John thinks they haven't done such a bad job on it. So if he says it's all right, I'll go along with him.
Well, that's lovely to hear.
Yeah, yeah. Because this is one of he was a partner in John Brunton and Partners, and they did two building societies. It was the Yorkshire Bank or Yorkshire Building Society, but it was designed as the Bradford Permanent Building Society. And there were a lot of in the north, there were a lot of building societies, and it was kind of like a bit of a sort of almost municipal pride thing. Yes, we've got our own building societies, and they would want to build significant headquarters. And John's firm, the John Tempest firm, also designed the Bradford and Bingley HQ, which was an amazing building. Unfortunately, I never got to photograph it, but it's been demolished now. And the other significant building society HQ in Yorkshire is the former Halifax Building Society headquarters, which was designed by BDP and is the most incredible steel, not concrete, glass kind of extrusion that kind of projects itself up above the kind of traditional Yorkshire grit stone housing and stuff, and it sits there like kind of an alien spaceship in the landscape of Halifax. It's just an incredible building. I mean,
yeah, an absolute showstopper, that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And another amazing showstopper, Hove Town Hall, a particular favourite of mine. I remember saying to somebody that I felt like rather than this being brutalist, it felt more cutilist because it's slightly adorable as a building. John Wells Thorpe designed this, and it was built in the early 70s. He was also designer of a number of modernist churches, and I think you can see in the design of this building there is a very kind of humane idea of how people interact with a sort of large civic building like this. And I think there's a lovely kind of sense of civic responsibility about the way that he approached his architecture. I wonder with this one, how do you manage to capture these buildings without people? You're amazing at kind of getting these buildings without any people in them, and yet loads of it. I mean, this building is always there's always loads of people around it whenever I've been there.
Yeah, I'm very patient. I wait a long time and curse it when another person walks around the corner. And it's like, can't you see I've got my tripod and my camera here? Get out of the way. No, I just have to wait.
And
generally.
is it the same with weather conditions as well?
I'm not so bothered about weather conditions as long as it's not raining. I'm kind of all right. But I particularly liked the light on this though. On
Mm.
that day, it just really it really gives volume to all that the forms and also the material quality. I mean, it's again, it's your kind of your favorite corduroy concrete, but it's actually enhanced by the addition of some, it's kind of got rough aggregate in there, which against the kind of quite slick glazing looks, I don't know, there's just so many material contrasts going on in that elevation that it just brings everything to life. And then the rather nicely designed clock just gives that little bit extra. So yeah, I think this is a great building. I mean, this is just the I can't remember, west elevation. Anyway, it's much larger than that. It sort of covers a lot of functions, and I believe it was really well used up until lockdown, and then they started to sort of wind down some of the services in there. Opposite it, there's actually a car park that was designed at the same time, a multi-level car park in very similar style to that. So it's a whole kind of civic complex of utter brutalism in the rather sedate streets of Hove. So it's kind of quite anomalous, but I like that. I like the bravery of doing that. And it seemed you could, I don't know, there was just a little bit more openness to experimentation in that you maybe wouldn't get today. So
Yeah, yeah. And now utter brutalism in a place where you would absolutely expect to find brutalism, Birmingham. So this is obviously New Street Signal Box, which is one of the most, I think, famous and photographed uh, bits of brutalist architecture in Britain. I mean, is it sculpture? Is it a building? Is it a lunar lander? It's probably all three. They also, the architects, Bicknell and Hamilton, they also designed Paddington's maintenance depot for British Rail again. So it's fascinating that a lot of brutalist architecture was involved in big infrastructure projects as much as it was in other things that people might be using more to live in, or as we've just seen, the town halls and that kind of stuff. So it is very interesting. Now you work. I don't know whether you work entirely in black and white, but I don't think I've ever seen any of your photos that haven't been black and white. Do you work entirely in black and white?
I in Concrete Poetry, which was about post-war public sculpture, there are a few color shots in there because some of the sculpture was so brightly colored that they really deserve to have be treated in color. But generally speaking, no, I work primarily in black and white. I deliberately chose to do that because I was more interested in the sculptural qualities of these buildings initially. And it seemed like the best way to show that off. I mean, it kind of rids you of any of the extraneous kind of an annoying and distracting flashes of color and cars and advertising and signage, and it kind of allows you to look more uh, concisely at the kind of the architectural and sculptural forms.
Yeah, we've got a car right on the edge of this image here, and I imagine that had it not been a black and white image, that car would have interrupted that image quite significantly.
Yeah, yeah, and it also, I mean, I'm also very interested in the way these buildings have been photographed historically. So
Mm.
I'm very interested in the in the photographers who worked with the architects to initially document their buildings, like Henk Snook and Martin Charles and John Donat and people.
Mhm.
And obviously, at the time, black and white photography was predominant, and they all shot in black and white. Although later, some of them would start using color. But I really like the way that their photographs almost seem timeless because they're in black and white, and I feel that this allows my images of these buildings to allow in a slightly timeless zone as well. So you can't always tell necessarily when, other than if you're a real car obsessive and look at, the latest model of car or whatever. So I like the fact that it gives a slight ambiguity to the to dating it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the police headquarters here in Blackpool, that you can kind of tell from the kind of the crumbling nature of some of the balustrades and stuff. As you look around this area, they're a bit of a giveaway of the ravages of time, aren't
Yeah,
they?
yeah,
And
yeah.
Lancashire County Architect Department designed a lot of brutalist police stations. You'll find other ones they did in Bury, Wigan, Skelmersdale, Morecambe, Lancaster, and Preston. I mean, I do think this is obviously Blackpool, and it would be lovely to see a Strictly dance routine around here across that bridge. Unlikely, but still lovely. But they were the largest municipal architect department outside of London. And so they designed a lot of these police stations. That made me wonder how you decide which buildings to photograph or which ones to include in your books when you're doing them. When it's quite in some areas that you're photographing in, it's quite overwhelming, the choice, isn't it?
Absolutely. As you say, Roger Booth, who he was the head of the Lancashire Architects Department, he sort of rolled these buildings out. I mean, I think once he had a formula, he was just like, yeah, let's go with this, because there's very similar one in, I think, in Morecambe, and somewhere else that I've forgotten. But you have to cut, for me, when I'm photographing a project, this came from the Brutal North
Mm.
project that I did, which was like basically a post-war architecture in the north of England. There's really only so much you can do, and I try and with the research I do, I try and fit the one in that I think will photograph best, really. I mean, I'm looking for the image. It's that whole Rayner Banham thing of memorability of image, and I take that as a kind of bit of a touchstone when I'm looking for buildings to photograph. So, and also there is the element of at risk, because this building is due to be demolished. I don't quite know what the schedule is, but it's now empty. The buildings to the right of it are the magistrates' courts. I don't know. I think they're being wound down, and the whole it's a bit of a mega structure. It's a sort of civic area, including courts, the police station, some council facilities, car park, and I think the whole lot is earmarked for demolition. Unfortunately, in my mind, but I don't think it's very popular up in Blackpool.
You don't get many popular police stations, to be fair.
No, true.
Wyndham Court. I mean, I feel like the spirit of Owen Hatherley is with us tonight with this one. Lancaster Ellis, who designed this, loads of famous architects worked for them. James Stirling, James Gowan, Neve Brown, among many others. But one of the things that really struck me about this and some of the other images is, how do you gain access to some of these places? Because some of them aren't that easy to gain access to, either because they're sort of private residences or because they're actually sort of screened off. They're quite often behind some kind of fence or barrier that I don't know. How do you charm your way into these places?
I can't remember if this was, I took this quite a long time ago, and I think Wyndham Court might have been a bit more accessible then in terms of, gated. I think it certainly is more so now, because I remember last time I went, trying to have a look around and thinking, I can't walk in here anymore. And a lot, understandably, to some degree, a lot of buildings have gone that way, because their residents have found that they don't, there's sort of possibly antisocial elements mingling with them and sort of obsessive brutalist fans wandering around their corridors. So I generally ask, but if something is closed there and I want to get in, I'll wait for someone to come along and sort of give them a nice little bit of chat about how fantastic their building is, and could I have a quick look inside? And most people are pretty accommodating. Actually, most people are quite interested. If you're interested in their their dwelling, their living space, a lot of people quite often have very positive things to say. So they want to share it and they want to show people.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably the case with Wyndham Court. I think it's quite a well regarded piece of housing. It kind of, you can get a sense of bleakness from it because the concrete is weathered. And this is the concrete that is not painted in magnolia paint. Okay, so it's actually been allowed to sort of take on the sort of with all the markings and the staining and stuff that happens with weathering. I mean, whether or not you decide at some stage, yeah, we will clean this, or you leave it to go that way, I don't really have a very strong opinion on that because I like all they kind of the accretions of time, aren't they? They give it that sort of that's just what happens, and I think that should be allowed to happen. And rather than trying to cover it with a layer of paint just to make everything seem clean and homogenized, maybe allow concrete to do what it does, and then canvass opinion amongst the residents and say, shall we clean this or shall we leave it? I think it looks rather magnificent, and there's this whole because it's in Southampton, obviously there's that sort of nautical connection, and the whole thing makes allusions towards ocean liners. So you have this sort of almost like the bow of the ship there on the left-hand side, and that whole wing of the building sweeps back almost like the sort of like the hull of a liner. So there's these nice nautical connections going on there.
Yeah,
I actually very much enjoyed the commission. I mean, it's a huge housing estate.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm aware that we've probably only got about 10 minutes left, and we want to try and have time for a few questions. And we've got a couple of more images to get through. So should we quickly just have a look at those, and then we can get to some questions. Here we are. I sort of feel like I'm in the middle of the French Connection here, but we're underneath Spaghetti Junction at Gravelly Hill Interchange, and I imagine that when you're out taking some of these photos, you must feel a bit isolated.
Well, this is kind of quite a strange place. This I can't remember the name of it. It's like a circus or something, and it's right at the sort of almost like the epicenter of Spaghetti Junction, which is it's a 3.5 mile long viaduct, which it interconnects with railways, with canals. So it's a real sort of hub of transport. And within it, there's these circuses, so pedestrians can basically travel from one side to the other. And it's actually quite busy that. As I took my photographs there, I saw there were quite a few people using the underpasses to get through from one side of the junction to the other. So no, I didn't feel that lonely. I had to wait for people to get out of the way again.
Not angry, just cross.
Well, they're great structures. Anyway, yes, let's press on.
Yeah, absolutely. The Cumbraine, one of my favourite new towns. I really love that you photographed Fairwater shopping precinct, which is quite a small shopping precinct, but it's got very incredibly dramatic sculptural stairwell at one end. Really brilliant. And then, obviously much more well known are the William Mitchell panels here. And again, it's sort of like another sort of representation of your interest in sculpture, isn't it? And also there's a real sense, a bit like we were talking about in the weathering, of sort of ancient and modern going on with a lot of this stuff, isn't there?
Yeah, well, as I was saying before with Wyndham Court, I mean, I think the patina of time has marked those staircases remarkably. I mean, I love it. I mean, I think there's because it's all board marked concrete with the impression of the wood grain and everything. It just picks up all this kind of like the grit and grime of rain that's passed over it for decades, and it kind of makes it more impressive in a sense, makes it more sculptural to me. Similar to the one on the right-hand side, which is just a rather nice designed sculptural. I love stairways as well, as you can probably tell, because of their sculptural qualities. But this stairwell in the middle is we talked about, in relation to Keith McCarthy, we talked about William Mitchell. He was a phenomenal sculptor and produced just so much stuff, not just in this country, but globally, particularly in the US. And this is just a really nice little example of these panels that he used to make what's a rather mundane building look far more interesting than it actually is.
Absolutely.
That's Gordon Redfern did these other forms. I don't really think much of his Monmouth House in relation to the other stuff he did, but William Mitchell's stairway makes it very memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're ending. The last image that we're going to see is Old Groveway in Milton Keynes. We'll come back to Milton.
Yay.
Lovely. And designed by Phipp and Randall and Parks, built in 1974. And so, you know, another new town. We've come home. This is in an area called Simpson. And it's got some other incredible modernist houses by Peter Womersley there as well. And I wondered, you know, with the kind of evolution of all these styles that we've seen, even within the kind of brutalist stuff, do you think your work's going to move beyond brutalism and sort of heroic modernism? Do you think you might end up covering Pomo or earlier styles or Art Deco or something?
Well, I tried doing Art Deco actually. It wasn't for me. It wasn't hugely successful or satisfying. I did a map with Blue Crow Media of
Oh
Art
yeah,
Deco sites, which is a nice thing in itself and beautifully designed. Blue Crow always do great stuff, but I really struggled to get into Art Deco, and I thought, well, I should probably stick to what I know and like, and that is really the post-war modernism. Yeah.
as you can see here, the whole selection of amazing books on postmodern modernism that you've done. I mean, it's an amazing body of work. I just wanted to see whether we've got any questions here. We have.
Yeah. You have one from David Thomas, John.
Yes, lovely.
Is the Tricorn Centre the quotes Euston Arch unquote of brutalism, or do Simon and John have other contenders?
Well, Trinity Square car park as well. Owen Luder, well, he worked with an architect, a young architect called Rodney Gordon, who was possibly more responsible for some of the design than Owen was. Certainly for the Tricorn Centre, Eros House in Catford, and the Trinity Square in Newcastle. But the unfortunate thing about Owen Luder practice was that the vast majority of his buildings have been demolished. And I remember talking to him, and he was very keen that his building should be allowed to live on in a sense. And I posthumously, really, after the fact of their demolition, and he sort of asked me if I could write a biography, which I kind of thought, no, I can't. I take photographs, but I couldn't. I'd love to do a photographic book about your work, but I certainly couldn't write it. And anyway, I think somebody should do that book, because I don't think their work was recognised enough, and they had a very, very large impact on the national landscape, and they should be recognised for what they did, rather than see every single building they did demolished. It's a bit of a sad story, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on my one would probably be Birmingham Central Library. I think that was a terrible loss and a terrible mistake, and an amazing building to have lost.
Yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
Yes. So we had a question: has Simon any plans for brutalism in other countries?
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to finish here first, so I mean, it's keeping me busy enough. As I said, there's a Scottish book on the way, and then there's maybe a larger survey looking at the entirety of the country, because I haven't really covered the south of England too much, or the West Country, Cornwall, Devon. There's some very interesting stuff down there, so I'd like to kind of get that covered off, but I am becoming increasingly interested in the States, in the US, and I mean, obviously there have been books done about it, but I think the interest there is growing, and I'd like to explore some of it myself. Some of the campuses, some of the incredible, the heroic Boston architecture.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot out there, and that's where I think I might be heading after this country's finished.
Amazing. You're like this country's finished. That's another.
Yes,
Um,
well, hopefully not, but you
no,
know,
but you're like a kind of storm chaser now, aren't you? You're sort of like you know, uh that I can't remember the name of the film now, the Twister. You're like traveling around
yes,
in your car,
yeah.
chasing
Well,
brutalism before it gets knocked down,
exactly. Get it before
quite
it's too
badly
late.
clad. Somebody, Castrix has pointed out that Hotan Hall reminds of those the Ladybird modernism, the representation of modernism in Ladybird books, which I think is a very fair comment.
Oh, okay. I'm not aware of that, but I shall have to have a look.
There's a lot of modernism in Ladybird books, and it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. And somebody's asked if you photograph using black and white camera settings, or are they taken in color and then converted?
No, well, originally I started off with film, but now, I mean, it's more expedient to use digital. So I always shoot in color on raw file setting, because I mean that's the way you're going to get the most information out of the sensor, and then I convert them all to black and white.
Cool, cool. Ollie Mould has asked about the sort of contrast between the sort of whole building shots and the detail shots, and do you think one or more is important when capturing brutalism? And do you think it's important to kind of show both, or can you do it through
Well,
one?
yeah, I mean, when I first started on this, like, I don't know, maybe, can't remember, 20 years ago. I was, as I said, I studied sculpture, and I was very much interested in the sculptural qualities, the material qualities, the way light played on, and so I looked more at sort of compositions that would be, they're almost like crops, so they're accentuating the materiality of the concrete, of the board marking. So I was always looking maybe a little closer in.
Mhm.
As I've kind of progressed through this, I began to see there's a bit of a necessity here to contextualize that image. So I got wider and would take in more of the entirety of the building. So I think the two obviously have to work in conjunction. But yeah, sometimes the crop, the detail just tells you almost a lot more than the wider picture can. So
Yeah.
it works both ways, you know. I think that they're obviously quite symbiotic, and ideally you would show both together.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then we had a question from David Thomas, Sussex, Essex, UEA. Pick a university. I went to Essex
Yeah.
only because of the architecture. He said that. Yeah, Essex is sort of fascinating because that idea of that kind of very unadorned campus, where the idea that the students were going to be the decoration, they were going to be the thing that brought it to life, and that actually that was sort of part of the actual design of the Essex campus, which I thought was fascinating.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I did a
Really different
project.
campuses, aren't they?
I did a really good project with Leeds University about the new universities, and their campus extension was designed by Chamberlain, Powell and Bon, and
Hmm.
it was really seen as the precursor to the new universities, because a lot of the research they did and a lot of the implementation of the ideas were taken on by the architects who worked on the actual new university, sort of out of town campus scenarios, like Lasden's UEA and Spencer's Sussex University.
Yeah.
So I think they're wearing where they were an incredible achievement, and they're something that the post-war Britain should be proud of, and still should be proud of them, because they're fantastic sites.
And it is interesting, actually, that a lot of the things that I think we're sort of celebrating around sort of post-war Britain are like from the new towns to British architecture to the kind of civic nature of things that they represent, are things that are quite easily dismissed in the sort of current climate, but are things that I think we need to kind of treasure, and we need to constantly reiterate how important and how transformational those things were. I would say I'm UEA all the way.
Yeah, well, it's
or at least two of our guests, I see.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Although Angela got married in Basil Spencer's meeting house at Sussex
Oh,
University.
the
How
meeting
lovely
house
is
is
that?
marvelous building. Yeah.
She has a great question, which picks up on a phrase that I've learnt this evening, Simon. John expressed his delight in corduroy concrete, which is a phrase that's going to live with me. Does Simon have any particular features of brutalist architecture that get him excited when he comes across them?
I'm constantly in a frenzy of excitement when I see a brutalist building. I can hardly contain myself. But no, honestly, anything that combines board mark concrete, which hasn't been painted, with brick infill panels, that's really my go-to brutalism.
It's the chef's kiss.
Yeah.
A question from Litfest chairman who has form architecturally. We should warn you. Representation, thank you. The images of these heroic buildings reflect not only the architects but their clients, many of them across the public sector. Where, apart from rail and utilities, are today's heroic clients?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there are some local authorities that have, like Norwich, with have sort of tried to do some stuff, but everything is done on quite a small scale because people just don't really have the money to do that kind of stuff in the sort of public realm in the same way that they did. So I sort of feel like at the moment we're in a bit of a kind of doldrums of having sort of outside of sort of big new sort of infrastructure projects having people commission.
Yeah, I mean, as John just intimated, there's some very nice small local authority housing schemes by people like Peter Barber and I can't Lynch Architects. Anyway,
yeah,
there are some nice schemes, but they're few and far between, and they're very modest in scale generally.
Kind of ties into another question. Again, so I think we're probably coming to the end of our run now. But Rob Evans saying, thank you. Very interesting to find out about the series of Lancashire police stations. As was I, that brutalist police station is another phrase to conjure with, surely. Are there other notable local authority series?
Other notable local authority what?
Series of buildings. Are there, in the same way that Lancashire did police stations, are there other local authorities that did notable series of particular types of buildings?
Yeah, definitely, and not just kind of brutalist, but kind of modernist stuff. So like Hertfordshire schools, and also Yorkshire schools, were two sort of areas where they both kind of exported their kind of amazing systems for building schools around the country, and in fact around the world. So that was incredibly two very successful kind of examples of that, I think.
Simon, you've got an invite to Norwich to look at interesting local authority housing schemes.
Have I? I like Norwich actually. There are some little pockets of housing by an architect I can't remember who did these really nice little sort of almost vernacular, modernist vernacular sort of infill housing in the actual inner city. I wish I could remember his name, but really good. And there's a fantastic former post office building. I think it's called Crown Square, the Crown Building, but
yes,
that's an incredible brutalist building set next to an incredible brutalist cinema, and I think they're both slated for demolition unfortunately. So
The name David Percival has been mentioned in a
that
follow-up,
sounds familiar.
which I think leads us to a perfect final question from John. With all the austerity, sorry, I get the right teeth in, and cuts, lots of public brutalist buildings are seen as prime for demolition and development. Do we need a photographic campaign to save what we have left?
Well, I mean, obviously the 20th Century Society do a phenomenal job in trying to raise consciousness about preserving our architectural heritage. So they lead a lot of campaigns. I don't know how much. I guess if everyone went around with a camera and took photographs of buildings that were kind of in danger, that would be a good thing because you'd be compiling a massive public record. I don't quite know how that would be coordinated, but the there's a German museum whose name I've momentarily forgotten, but they run it's an ongoing survey of buildings globally that are in in a state of disrepair or about to be demolished, and they've been raising awareness of it for quite a long time now. If I remember the name, I'll tell you.
But I do think, I think your project of, going around the country recording these buildings has been incredibly useful document of these places that many of us didn't realize existed. You have kind of investigated a lot of places that maybe have been kind of like overlooked in a kind of sort of wider discourse around them, and I think that's has been a really important and a significant thing. So I don't think we should underplay your role actually in revealing that stuff. I think and documenting it and preserving it in kind of in actual memory, and because some of those buildings won't exist in sort of 10 years time, and that will be very sad, but we will at least have your record of these places, which is
thank you for saying that. I mean, I never really intended it as a kind of document to just to record. I had my own self-interest, as I've always said. I was basically creating my artwork out of these buildings, and if there is this kind of like also this benefit of actually having a document of Britain's modernist heritage, that's also great, and I feel good to have contributed to that. That's it. The Deutsches Architecture Museum. Someone posted that.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been absolutely fascinating. I have hopefully allowed our audience to unmute themselves. So if any of them would like to do so and give you a well-earned round of applause, go for it, people. And then I shall read a few final parting words.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Generous ripple of appreciation and very much deserved. Thank you, everybody, for your company this evening. And we hope you found it as fascinating and informative as we have.